Good afternoon. Welcome to Special Collections and our first spring event for 2021. I'm Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Director of Special Collections and Archives, and today we'll be featuring our photograph exhibit, Comacina Improvisations and Variations, which has been curated by Paul Bright. While we can't be together to enjoy this exhibit, we have found a unique way for you to interact with our curator, Paul Bright, and hopefully it will be a rewarding visit for you. For anyone who wishes to visit the exhibit, simply contact us at archives@wfu.edu and we will make a special appointment for you to come in, and the exhibit is available through July 30th. Paul was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and received his degree from the University of South Carolina. His artistic works have been presented in Europe, Canada, and the United States, and reside in many private and museum collections. Paul arrived at Wake Forest in 2004 and is currently the Director of Galleries and Programming for the Wake Forest University. Today we will be sharing a short film which documents Paul's artistic and curatorial thoughts about his photographs, which form the backbone of the exhibit. Paul will also share some of the objects that appear in the exhibit. And I also want to extend my great thanks to Barry Davis of ZSR Library IT for his assistance in editing, technology, and everything else. Thank you, Barry. Again, thanks for joining us, and let's get started. Paul, thank you so much for being here today. The first question I have for you is, can you describe Comacina and what it is like for those of us who have never been there?
So Comacina is this tiny island in the middle of Lake Como. It's the only island in Lake Como. And Lake Como sits on the border of Switzerland and northern Italy. It's about 30 minutes north of Milan. And the island is about, I guess, 600 yards long and maybe 200 or 150 wide, so it's tiny. And the history is like really interesting of the place because tons of events and actually a lot of structures were packed into this place over time, and there was a lot of fighting over the island between various forces from Milan and from Como, and this went on for some time, but by about the 1150s, most of the structures had been destroyed through these wars, and what's left now are mostly remains of religious structures. There's just the basic outlines of an old church, and there's even less of some earlier churches. But the scars in the landscape remain from all the history and from these buildings. And it's interesting because I didn't know much about the place before going to it. The application for the residency, wanted you to respond to the specifics of the place in some fashion. And my idea was I would make up something for the application without knowing a lot, but basically go with an open mind and trying to absorb something about the place. So I read about its history a little bit, but mostly I just sort of arrived trying to respond to the island, what was there, what I found there. And of course, immediately what was captivating were these remnants of structures. And so in this house that we stayed in, my wife was with me on the residency. It's about a 10 or 15-minute walk to the beach. The beach is this tiny little rocky sand spit on the mainland side of the island. And back and forth to the beach, you would find all sorts of things. And we're kind of inveterate pickers up of things. And we would find stones, we would find bones, we would find these mysterious things like this strange little thing that's in one of the photos. And come to find out that some of them were man-made products from fireworks, because they have this enormous festival for San Giovanni every June, and they just like blow up the island. And so there's all this detritus from that activity. But it's interesting how place and being in a place really kind of affects the work you do, even if it's so-called abstract work most of the time. An earlier residency that both Leanne and I had occupied was in Canada and at Cape Pine, and it's a very remote little appendage at the bottom of Newfoundland, and about as far east as you can go on the continent. And there's a lighthouse there, and there are buildings associated with it, and the residents reside in one of those. And we spent a month there let's see, 2006, I believe, and collected things there. And I didn't realize what they would lead to, but like, if you look at the images in this show, you'll see that it's about relationships of two found objects. And so here's an interesting one. It's a stone that's been naturally cleaved, and here's another one that seems to just want to fit right in it. We also just found rocks and other things that interest us on those beaches as well. And this one we always call the Milky Way or the universe rock, because it looks like the sky at Cape Pine at night when it's just so full of stars that you can't even identify constellations. So it always reminded us of that experience. But that was many years ago, and in between, I didn't do much with that sort of found object. Most of my work deals with found objects in the sense of like paper material, posters, waste that I make collages out of, or sound that I record for sound collages. So it's always about finding something and working with it, sort of dealing with what's right in front of you rather than trying to apply a concept to something. The idea sort of comes from your interaction with the material, which sort of forms a basis for my work.
The title of this exhibit is Comacina Improvisations and Variations. How did you choose that title?
Yeah, so when I was working with the objects, I was thinking about how they came to be in my head and on my work table in Comacina. What is it about them that's sort of interesting to me in arranging them and finding those relationships? And they were improvisatory. There was nothing pre-planned. It was seeing something and making a connection visually or otherwise to another thing that you combined it with. And there are variations in the sense that you'll find certain of the objects get repeated through the images. So, it's like, okay, we're going to use red rock with this thing, and that works kind of interestingly. And then this rock with that thing. And that's where the variations come in. And I always saw them as just these brief encounters between these objects, and then they would go on to have some other life with another object or in another place.
Paul, can you tell me about the relationship between these objects and what you think they represent relative to the current state of society and our obsession with possessions and ownership?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So the objects, you find them, they're already made or made by nature in some cases and existing in the world. So you're not making this thing. In a sense, you don't really own it either, because who owns the geology, right? Or who owns the poster that's come off the billboard in Milan that I use in a collage? It's become overlooked, it's become waste in some cases. And in some cases, you're sort of borrowing the objects. Like, I sort of broke rules in bringing these in today, or even collecting them, because they don't really belong to me. I've borrowed them from this place. Many of the things that you find in the photographs that I used, I left there. But for some reason, I felt like it might be interesting to hold on to these for a little longer. And so the sense of ownership isn't as great. Obviously, if I take paper that I found and glue it into a collage, then that thing is something I've made and sent back out into the world. But it all seems like a sense of borrowing to me more than ownership. And maybe that sort of opposes the ownership ethos that we so live with now. The ownership society, remember that was from like the 2000s. Everyone was going to own everything. But it's often the things that you can't tangibly grasp and hold on to, the experiences, the ideas that are the things that really end up resonating with you. And they can be evoked by ideas, by art, by things you find, but they can also be shared in a way that owned things can't. So that's maybe at the basis of some of this.
Paul, when I work with historic documents, I often think of them traveling through time, being touched or handled by people in the past. How would you describe the time relationship in your images, where in many cases you have combined a geologic object with something more current?
Yeah, time is really important to me in my work in funny ways, I guess. With the paper collages, there's a sense almost of recent geological time, because you can see where the layers have been accreted and where they've been ripped away, and you can kind of see, well, this is the most recent thing and this is the oldest thing in that layer. It's almost like looking at strata in geology. So when I take those sections of posters or whatever that I've found or ripped off and then recombine them with other ones, you know, I'm making fault lines within that geology. I'm mixing things in a strange way, so it's multiple senses of time. And then, of course, the imagery that's involved in them can refer to a specific time, but sometimes doesn't. It's too abstract. So what you have is a very complicated kind of amalgam of times, not just a single time. And that sort of concept of time to me is important. We tend to live in conceptually a linear time where, you know, we're starting here, we're going here, we're going to do this next thing, and we just kind of keep going on it like a treadmill until it stops for us. Then there are other concepts of time that are more circular, seasonal time, that sort of thing. And actually, I've come to try and think about time in a sense where it is linear, but it's linear like spaghetti in a bowl. So some of it curls on top of other times, and you've got depth to those layers of time. And sometimes those places where times cross, you can kind of punch through. It's like a wormhole. So you can find yourself with an ancient object that's 20,000 years old, and you get some inkling of what that was for, say, the people who made it. Never a full picture, but it allows you to sort of punch through that time, and it resonates with you differently. So time's a real complicated thing in the work, and it's sort of maybe a subtext to the visual aspects of it.
To continue on with the time theme, you shared a quote from T.S. Eliot earlier, quote, "To be conscious is to not be in time," unquote. What does this mean for those visiting this exhibit and seeing these images?
Yeah, so I was rereading some T.S. Eliot, the Four Quartets, and there's this line just kind of by itself, to be conscious is to not be in time, to be outside of time, which is really kind of a Zen-like idea of time. And it just the line itself in our day and age stops you short, right? Because we're on that treadmill of linear time. It's like, wait a minute, I thought I was being fully conscious on this treadmill. And what he's saying, in fact, is that no, you're part of the machinery of a certain idea of time when you're doing that, but you're not conscious at that point. And maybe the closest example to try and have people understand that the concept he's working at is the idea of being in the zone, as we say. So when you are in the studio, in my instance, or a place like that where you're fully concentrated on what you're doing at the moment, time sort of falls away, it disappears. It isn't something you are aware of anymore. And that way, you are fully sort of yourself with the activity. It's a hard thing for Westerners to grasp, I think. We are so goal-oriented, and we're always after the next task to knock off the list. But when something can stop you short and make you contemplate, and then it becomes sort of like a rock thrown into a still pool, and you get these nice resonances that wave out to the shore, and they come back, and there's depth to it. And it makes you aware better, I think, of your place in the universe. And I think that's what Eliot was getting at. And hopefully with the images, too, they sort of do that. They're these simple combinations of things in pairs that, in some cases, you don't even know what they are. And they've made this brief connection with one another, even look like they're colliding sometimes. And then that's going to come apart, and they'll have a new relationship with another object, or they'll be eventually back in the world of many objects. So it's just that moment where we see that interaction and that relationship that makes us think of other moments, other interactions. It broadens out into more of a universal, holistic look at things.
Getting back to the T.S. Eliot quote and also your concept of a cone, I'm wondering if you see these images as a riddle in some way.
You know, that's a little hard for me to say. This happens with the sound collages as well, too, because I can identify a lot more in them than the viewer would, and I forget that occasionally because I was there when I found the object or when I recorded the sound. Although there are cases I forget, you know, where these things have come from. So for me, it's less of a riddle than it is just dealing with the things as they are in the relationship. Like with the sound collages, sometimes the least interesting thing to do is trying to identify, oh, what's that sound, what's that sound? Because it's about how they all come together and how they are sort of disembodied from us in a way already. They're abstracted. Just an example, when people listen to music or hear sounds attentively, they forget how much visual stimuli is affecting how they're hearing it. And when you take that away, when you're presenting just the sound, it can be very disorienting, even when it's a sound you're you know, accustomed to, like a refrigerator humming or something. Out of context, you're not quite sure what that is. Same thing happens a little bit here. These are rocks and feathers and bones and so forth, but they're out of their context. They are also out of their context in terms of scale. I'm photographing them, and they're much bigger in the photographs, and especially here, than they are in reality. So it kind of makes them more monumental. So I guess the riddle aspect is maybe something people experience, but it's not something I strive for. It's maybe a little more direct for me.
After this exhibit, these images will continue to be available in special collections as part of an artist's compendium. And for you, is there a difference between how people experience that compendium as opposed to coming and seeing these images? Is there a difference or not?
Yeah, and maybe it's a little bit like if you see images in an exhibition, obviously this thing called the exhibition's been made to focus on, you know, a certain span of work by an artist or artists. So it's drawing your attention specifically to them, and maybe even within that to something specific about them. When it's part of a compendium of other works, other artists, then it becomes a little more museum-like maybe, or maybe it's more studio-like, depending how the work is held together. You could easily see some of these images being combined with other images from even special collections, from, you know, books that seem to share something about the approach to image making that's here, or just the ideas that arise from them. So it's another level of interactions then, right? So I've made my case with these images of how I think these things interact, but there are other possibilities with other artworks, other objects, maybe even something you find on the street and bring in. So it just adds yet another layer to the potential for that.
What else do you want viewers to experience when they see these images?
It was a time when I wanted to sort of declutter myself mentally and otherwise, and going to Comacina seemed perfect for that. It was, you know, a really sort of basic place in a way. The housing was an elegant, interestingly designed building, but it was very basic. The island is basic. I could shed a lot of stuff that I had been kind of dealing with, and I could start fresh in approaching things. And so for me, it was sort of an act of active contemplation to put these together and to photograph them, and I'm certainly hoping that that comes across to the viewer. I think one of the problems with especially American society, which is very kinetic, it's all about moving and doing, and we mean that in a very physical, literal way often. But the act of close looking and viewing and contemplation actually, you know, is not a passive thing at all. It's something that the brain is like really working at. So that's what I want these works to do in some sense.
Is there anything else you would like to share about this exhibit?
I think maybe just to go back to one of the earlier questions about the found and how I came to use that as sort of as the touchstone for a lot of this work, no pun intended. I have a mentor, a really fine painter, James Rosen, who always exhorted his students to have a philosophy about the art they made, to really come up with sort of a mental structure that both sort of encompassed it and defined it to some degree, but also allowed you to move within it and to have sort of a common thread through the work you did. And for me, it evolved that everything I did involved the found in some sense. So found sounds that I make collages from, found paper material that I make more traditional material collages from, or the found things from Comacina, for example, which are natural, man-made. They're all sorts of different things. But you can see the commonality then, regardless of the aesthetic approach that I end up using, regardless of the sort of phenotype, let's say, of the works themselves, the outward appearance versus the genotype that holds them all together, which is the found.